Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you might be. My name is Kevin Michael Grace, and this is the Kevin Michael Grace Show. So, our leaders pride themselves on being rational and independent thinkers, but they are proved to be no more rational and independent than the Gadarene swine. I predicted a few weeks ago that if the bodies don't start stacking up like cordwood, then the elite is going to say that it's draconian measures smashing the economy and eliminating social contact with people were successful. Dave's Twitty Life says 12 years from now, just 60 more days to stop the spread. Come on, guys. We can do this. I see that my skeptical stance on the coronavirus panic has led to some unpleasantness. David Penson seems to be very upset with me, to give just one example. And Brendan Gill accused Peter Hitchens, Toby Young, and Brendan O'Neill of essentially not caring about mass death. So the broke stance was everyone who disagrees with me is a Nazi. The woke stance is everyone who disagrees with me is a mass murderer. Now, I was thinking, and I'm sure a lot of people have been thinking, that perhaps this coronavirus panic, if it is indeed the overwrought and irresponsible response that I believe it to be, that this would smash the dictatorship of science. Well, in that regard, I'm reminded that writing back in the 1970s, Thomas Szasz, who was a medical doctor and a psychiatrist, he had pointed out that science demands from us more than what the church demanded in the Middle Ages. Of course, this was before science demanded the end of life as we know it. So if the scientists and their expert acolytes have gone too far, well, they'll have their wagon fixed. And then I remembered something that I had written some years ago, which is Grace's law of the counterintuitive response. In any society that disdains truth, the reaction to any calamity that threatens its most dearly held lies is much more of that which engendered the calamity, only faster and harder. And we'll get back to that idea. Something amusing here. I assume that this is satirical, from Extinction Rebellion. Remember that? Remember when the seas were going to start boiling, and the Earth was going to be terraformed into Venus, and that we were all gonna die. Whee! Remember that? You don't hear many people talking about it anymore. Well, for an obvious reason. But anyway, this alleged post from Extinction Rebellion, clearly satire, says, "We were wrong, sorry. We have realized we are a bunch of panicky middle-class nihilists who hate the lower orders and have no sense of perspective. Life on Earth will not be affected by anything we do, and we feel impotent. We call this abrupt climate breakdown, but the breakdown is really in our heads. We realize now we are profoundly wrong about everything. Sorry." Well, one can only hope, according to the Sacramento Bee, coronavirus is now the third leading cause of death in the U.S., according to a San Diego doctor and data from the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. COVID-19 is now killing 748 people per day in the U.S., said Dr. Maria Danilichev. Only heart disease, 1,774 deaths per day, and cancer, 1,641 deaths per day, are killing more people daily than coronavirus. Well, do we know that this is actually the case, that COVID-19 is now killing 748 people per day in the U.S.? Well, no, we don't know that. because the authorities have decided to ascribe the cause of death to anyone with a COVID-19 to COVID-19. President Donald Trump said Tuesday the White House is predicting between 100,000 and 240,000 people in the U.S. will die from coronavirus. This could be a hell of a bad 2 weeks, Trump said. This is going to be 3 weeks like we've never seen before. Sadly, President Trump decided to cancel April, but I'm very much hoping, praying, in fact, that he will draw a line at the end of April and that on May 1st, things will start to get back to normal, because there's a serious question of whether there will be a normal if this shutdown lasts for much longer. We have people talking blithely about, oh no, the economy is going to start roaring back. Oh, really now? That businesses that have been wiped out are just going to, they're going to come back to life? They're going to rise from the ashes like the phoenix? I think a lot of the businesses, a great many businesses that are closed now will never return. And of course, this is all very good for big business. And early indications are that Amazon, Walmart, and Microsoft are going to emerge from the coronavirus panic much stronger than previously. Disney, I don't know, doesn't look too good for them. So we've been hearing a lot of a woman called Dr. Birx, who is, I guess, number 2 in the coronavirus task force in the United States. Bill Mitchell tweets, Dr. Birx admits using New York as a baseline for the 200,000 deaths model, despite the fact New York accounts for only 6% of the U.S. population, but 46% of COVID-19 deaths. To me, that seems like statistical malpractice. Yes, indeed, it does. So, according to Political Magazine, well, the headline is Trump's breakdown. Old traits, bluster, defiance, implacable self-promotion that once worked well now threaten to sink a presidency. Yes, and one can count on the American news media for a completely dispassionate, disinterested examination of any situation, particularly as it pertains to Donald Trump. So, starts off, this piece by John Harris starts off, comparison to Herbert Hoover. Remember Herbert Hoover? Well, nobody remembers Herbert Hoover, but apparently he was personally responsible for the Great Depression, notwithstanding the fact that Hoover's intervention in the American economy in an attempt to mitigate the effects of the stock market crash in 1929 was unprecedented. And the Democratic Party, in its 1932 platform, went so far as to condemn this as wholly unwarranted and something that could not be sustained. But in any event, before Herbert Hoover earned a reputation as a tragic figure, he had a reputation for heroic success, a can-do businessman who arrived in the presidency with no previous elective experience. He was one of the most celebrated men of his times. Then times changed. Ambition and anxiety both gnawed him constantly, the columnist Walter Lippmann wrote to Felix Frankfurter, then a law professor and later a Supreme Court justice, as Hoover floundered desperately during the early days of the Great Depression. He has no resiliency, and if things continue to break badly for him, I think the chances are against his being able to avoid a breakdown. When men of his temperament get to his age without ever having had real opposition and then meet it in its most dramatic form, it's quite dangerous. Well, not everyone had such a high opinion of Herbert Hoover. Calvin Coolidge, to give one example, mocked him as Wonder Boy. I will also point out that the Depression was worse in 1937 in America than it was in 1933 when Franklin Delano Roosevelt took office. In fact, the American Depression did not end until 1942. and America was at war with Japan and Germany at that time. But no, Herbert Hoover is the great loser, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt is the great winner, despite the fact that the only way that Roosevelt could get America out of the Great Depression was to sacrifice 400,000 American lives in World War II. So, Democrats say Google's COVID-19 ad ban is a gift to Donald Trump. As coronavirus spread around the world in February, Google decided to ban most non-governmental advertising about the outbreak in an effort to defeat misinformation. By the way, misinformation means non-official opinions, fraud, and scams. But Democrats say the Google ban does something else that allows the Trump administration to run ads promoting its response to the crisis while denying Democrats the chance to run ads criticizing it. Prominent Democratic PACs in recent days have funneled millions of dollars into television ads accusing Trump of mishandling the coronavirus crisis, but staffers of several Democratic nonprofits and digital ad firms realized this week they would not be able to use Google's dominant ad tools to spread true information. Yes, this is what counts as a balanced story. True information about President Trump's handling of the outbreak on YouTube and other Google platforms. Well, I think that Google is wrong about this. Trump has his say, and the Democrats should be able to pay for their say if that's what they want. But, I mean, don't expect true information from them. The theme of today's show is the price of matriarchy is eternal panic. And there is a perfect example in a piece published yesterday by the Globe and Mail, which I suppose is Canada's premier newspaper. It's a national newspaper, by a young woman called Robin Urbach. And the headline is stark. No more incremental measures. We need to enact tomorrow's policies today. So in other words, if you think this is totalitarianism, just wait. We haven't even begun to experience totalitarianism. She begins, the physical distancing measures in place across Canada will absolutely be outdated in 2 weeks' time, probably 1 week's time. The number of patients infected with COVID-19 across the country has not yet peaked, meaning the situation is still expected to get worse. Well, I'll just say that in BC, we've had, I believe, 7 or 8 deaths in the last 7 days. Maybe it hasn't peaked. That does not exactly sound like a catastrophe to me, but never mind. The pressure on our provincial healthcare systems will thus continue to intensify. And with that, we can expect further restrictions on movement, enhanced protective measures, and scaled up enforcement efforts to try to slow the spread of infection. For months, and especially in recent weeks, as we watch the coronavirus tear through northern Italy, epidemiologists and public health experts have been warning us that the only way to get on top of the resulting COVID-19 disease is to get ahead of it. Yes, are these public health experts explaining to us that the mean or average age of those dead in Italy is 78 or 79 years old? Have they been trumpeting that fact? Because if they did, a great many people, perhaps a majority, would say, well, it's not all that serious, is it? Looking back just 3 weeks when everyday life was still pretty much normal, it certainly feels as though the pace of change in Canada has been decidedly swift. Indeed, within just that short time, schools have closed, many workplaces have shut down, public gatherings have been canceled, and the border has been mostly slammed shut. But in terms of actual directives and enforcement, the rollout has been more gradual. Provinces that initially requested the closing of non-essential businesses have more recently ordered them shut down. The 14-day isolation period for incoming travelers, which was previously a request, only became a federal directive under the Quarantine Act last week. And the instruction that symptomatic Canadians stay home and isolate became an explicit prohibition on boarding domestic flights and trains just this past Monday. There is no practical use in debating now whether these measures ought to have been enforced more quickly. The mantra of disease containment is always that earlier is better, although hindsight confers a level of confidence that in the moment decision-making simply does not yield. Well, yes, I suppose we could have everyone from now on walking around in hazmat suits. I'm sure that would really put the kibosh on viruses, germ transmission generally. Perhaps that's something that we should be looking at. Obviously, had we known what we know now, Health Minister Patty Hajdu wouldn't have suggested border controls are useless. Provinces still allow small gatherings of people who don't live in the same home. At the time of writing, Alberta permits groups of 15 or fewer. Manitoba allows up to 10. Ontario and Nova Scotia up to 5. That should end. No more physical socializing with those outside the home. The rules across provinces should be standardized. Otherwise, it's impossible for the average person to keep track of the ever-changing rules, which is of particular importance to those who live along provincial borders. To that end, the provincial list of essential businesses should be whittled down to true essential businesses. Condo construction should be put on hold. No one needs to be shopping for new laminate flooring right now. And then she goes into the controversy about masks, which I won't get into. Perhaps most important, suggestions need to become rules. Enforcement stepped up. You see the voice of the eternal kindergarten teacher here? Halifax police have already issued tickets for people violating emergency orders, and Toronto police say they will soon follow suit. Keep in mind this as well. We're emptying the jails, or about to empty the jails here. But Calgary, as of right now, says it will not, which is a position that assumes we have time for incremental measures. Yes, the end days are here. The most extreme consideration is of cell phone tracking to monitor those in self-isolation, which is hugely fraught from a privacy and data collection perspective. Just considering the damage a single infected person can inflict on a population, it could very well be necessary. After all, over just a few weeks, we've watched the unthinkable become essential. We need to anticipate what will become essential soon and enact those measures soon. So in other words, I'm a woman and I am frightened. And so everything must come to a stop. At what point Robin Urbach would cease to be in a state of hysteria? Well, I guess we'll just have to wait and see. This matriarchy of which I speak has brought with it this harmed-based view of the world, that anything that causes harm cannot be allowed. Well, many, if not most, of human activities entail some sort of harm. Pretty much all industry, for instance, results in pollutants of one form or another. But you see the matriarchy in climate extinction. That, oh, yes, the oil and gas industries, which are so important to Canada, they must be shut down, and the oil and the gas must be left. The oil in the ground and the gas in the ground must be left there forever because carbon is released. Of course, mankind's deadly enemy. Man has always hated carbon. You see this mimesis here that, oh, carbon is bad. Well, didn't they teach you in school that carbon was the sine qua non of life on Earth? That people are referred to as carbon-based life forms? No, but I keep hearing that carbon is bad, bad, bad. So draconian measures must be taken. This, until fairly recently, a piece such as Robin Urbach's would have been seen as, well, mad, which it is, but the media is racing to get ahead of this. Specifically, I'm calling for more draconian measures than you are. Where's the evidence that these draconian measures even work? And where's the evidence that the scale of this problem is such that they are necessary? Let's go to the chat here. I see Chad Chadson is back. That is very good. Chago Kin 666 says, this clapping out the window shit is starting to bug me because it's contrived and phony. Of course it's phony. New jacket, Kevin? No, it's an old jacket. It's all my jackets are old. They were given to me by my father more than 2 decades ago. Let's see. YT says I paid rent today. One, I didn't pay today. Two, okay, asking people to vote. Ricky Bullock says I'm being tested for COVID tomorrow. I asked to be tested for the flu as well, and they wanted me to go into a building to get tested for flu and then go to the drive-through to be tested for COVID. Stupid. Le Comte de Boreas says it keeps rolling in my head. Our surgery was successful. The patient is dead. The economy is dead. Disney has a monopoly. They will be fine, says Walrus Lolbertarian. Yes, they have I suppose, a near monopoly. I believe something about 90% of films released in theaters are Disney films. However, are people going to go back to the movies? Are they going to go back to theme parks? Yes, I wonder about that. This remains to be seen. Claire Caw asks, why would anyone want to be tested? If you have it, do you want to go to hospital? They have already told you indirectly that you might prefer to die in your own home. Ricky Bullock says, I work at a hospital. It would be irresponsible of me to not get tested. Besides, if it does require treatment to come back from completely, I can get treatment. I was sick like this in late January and never got completely over it. YT says, yeah, can we actually start calling our society matriarchal already? It obviously is at this point. Well, Dave Pinson was on at me last night. Well, what about Hungary? Well, you know, horses for courses. People are taking advantage of coronavirus in different places in different ways. And in Hungary and in Serbia, they have returned to their strong man past. Whereas in the West, particularly the Anglosphere, we've taken the view, the new matriarchal view, that if something is capable of causing harm, it must be banned. Okay, let's see what else we got. We got something from, okay. Alex Tillage, do I need to be laid off to access the Canada Emergency Response Benefit? No, workers who remain attached to their company can receive the benefit. Metal Mike says the government is also encouraging companies to put their employees back on payroll. Alex Tillage says Canada is dispersing NEET bucks. Yeah. Essentially, we're going to be looking at a situation very shortly where roughly 50% of Canadian adults will not be at work. Clearly, that is not sustainable for very long at all, especially since the Canadian economy was already looking pretty grim before coronavirus. Newfoundland is bankrupt. The collapse in the fall of oil has resulted in Alberta essentially being bankrupt. I mean, there has to be, for the government to engage in Keynesianism, somebody has to be working. There's got to be a productive sector in the economy, whereas Robin Urbach is determined, no, that only truly essential businesses must be allowed to stay open. So let's hammer that economy even more. Is the Globe and Mail an essential service? I don't know. We have, essentially 3 national newspapers in Canada? Do we need 3 national newspapers? Of course, the media has taken the position, as I was mentioned yesterday, that they are more important than ever because we need more panic. Don from Beyond says, my state of Florida locks down tomorrow night at midnight. I have dispensation from DoorDash on my phone to show officers that I am on an essential mission. Okay, first, there was 1, essential jobs, and then 2, essential travel. And what's coming up? Number 3? Number 3 is going to be essential and non-essential people. We could be looking at a big cull here. Oh, okay. What else do we got here? Alex Delarge says stocks like Zoom and Netflix are being used as trading vehicles. What is that? Quachalongo says a KMG Don Cherry jacket. Hey, from Peruvian Amazon. Um, Don Cherry's jackets were famously lurid. I think mine are much more tasteful. Chad Chadson says, I found out today I'm not laid off and I'll be getting paid for my time off. That's very good to hear. The Lipped one says, I need 40,000 ventilators. Okay. YT says, I lost half of my income and have no new business for the past few weeks. That is bad news indeed. Okay, so Andrew Coyne, who is not technically a woman, he has been screaming in agony for weeks in the Globe and Mail. He is Canada's leading conservative writer. He is a radical autonomist and is far away from a conservative, as could be imagined, but that's the world that we live in Canada, where our enemies get to decide what constitutes conservatism. He writes, should we sacrifice grandma for the GDP? That more or less sums up the debate in much of the U.S. media over the past week, ever since Donald Trump mused aloud to a Fox News reporter about relaxing the already patchy American shutdown of social and economic activity in time for Easter, a position he has since recanted. Underlying Trump's initial impulse were several supporting assumptions that the impact of the coronavirus epidemic is unlikely to be far out of line with previous experience, especially with the flu, that it affects mostly the elderly, which it does, and that the economic costs of the kinds of social distancing measures governments have imposed to date are too great, even in the short term, to be justified. Ergo, sorry, Grandma. Trump didn't say so explicitly, but a number of his more idolatrous supporters did. If some number of the elderly have to die prematurely to save the economy, so be it. Or, as Trump put it on Twitter, we cannot let the cure be worse than the problem. Yes. So you see, Trump is effectively a mass murderer. That's the position being taken by the left and by official Canadian conservatism. There's lots wrong with this. By the coronavirus is orders of magnitude. Orders of magnitude. My, worse than the flu. The flu kills roughly 60,000 Americans annually at most. The coronavirus could kill as many as 2.2 million. Oh, yes, based on what? According to an influential study by experts at the Imperial College of London. Well, it's already been scaled back significantly by Professor Neil Ferguson. Death rates are much lower for the non-elderly, but not insignificant. Oh, really? Nor as important are hospitalization rates, and an overwhelmed hospital system would lead to many more needless deaths, not just among coronavirus sufferers, but patients with other conditions. Well, the coronavirus panic has already led to needless deaths because we're having essential surgery canceled, so that everyone who believes himself to be symptomatic is overrunning the hospitals, or so we are told. I understand from various reports that the media has greatly exaggerated the turmoil that exists, say, in New York City. He concludes, suppose then the social distancing succeeds in reducing the U.S. death toll from 2.2 million, the worst case scenario, to only 100,000. That's a cool U.S. 21 trillion in lives saved, worth about as much as the entire U.S. GDP, save grandma. This is an extraordinary position, actually, because there is already a debate in the medical community about what measures should be taken to prolong the lives of, say, people above the age of 80. Should they be getting heart bypass operations, for instance? I mean, you can spend an enormous amount of money in order to prolong a life, 3 months, 6 months? And it is a fact that over a lifetime, 50% of a person's total medical costs will be incurred, typically, in the last 6 months of life. This was something that was brought home to Enoch Powell when he was Minister of Health in Britain. That when the National Health Service was brought in after the Second World War, there was an assumption that it was like a swamp to be drained, that the British people had all this resident illness because they weren't getting proper treatment because they couldn't afford it. And so when treatment was available to all of them, then Britain would be a much healthier country, and that actually health costs would go down. But what they learned was, and should have been fairly obvious from the beginning, is that people who survive sickness live to get sick again. There is no point, we talk about people being cured of various illnesses, but they always get another illness and they all eventually die. We're talking about 2.2 million, and this number, the media is attempting to drum this number into people's heads. And I believe the reason why is because people are going to believe that 2.2 million people did die because of coronavirus, regardless of the true number. And as for social distancing saving 2.1 million lives, there is no possible way to discover whether this was the truth, because there was no testing, virtually no testing done of people who were not quite sick when this whole thing started. People are being tested when they show symptoms, and most of these people are in their late 70s, and they already suffer, as we discussed with regard to Italy yesterday, from 1, 2, or 3 or more comorbidities. My old colleague, Colby Kosh, who writes for the National Post, he's not a sissified person. He points to a study in the Lancet. Researchers estimate that behavior changes have already saved 59,000 lives in 11 Western European countries. Yeah, how did they come up with this number? They pulled it out of the air. See, they're already claiming victory at a time at which we're told that by Robin Urbach and others that not enough has been done, that people must be scared to death, in some cases literally, and banned from all human activity. They're already claiming victory. It's remarkable how they do that, isn't it? Well, what does Bill Gates have to say? Well, according to GeekWire, he has outlined 3 steps U.S. government needs to take to save lives and get the country back to work. Gates is described as the Microsoft co-founder and global health expert. He published his proposed plan in a Washington Post column Tuesday afternoon. It's a 3-step process that would help curb the COVID-19 outbreak that could kill between 100,000 and 240,000 Americans based on government estimates shared Tuesday. Wait a minute, I thought it was 2.2 million Americans. There's no question the United States missed the opportunity to get ahead of the coronavirus, but the window for making important decisions hasn't closed. There's still room for more totalitarianism. Step 1. Shutdown. Allow states to enact their own social distancing mandates is a recipe for disaster. Well, goodbye, federalism. Federalism is now officially dead because people can travel across state lines and spread the virus. Until the case numbers start to go down across America, which could take 10 weeks or more, no one can continue business as usual or relax the shutdown. Any confusion about this point will only extend the economic pain, raise the odds that the virus will return and cause more deaths. That's easy for a man who is worth tens of billions of dollars to say. Gates said more tests need to be made more available, and the resulting data should be aggregated so we can quickly identify potential volunteers for clinical trials and know with confidence when it's time to return to normal. He said there also should be clear priorities for who gets tested given the lack of test kits. Well, obviously, if there's lack of test kits, those people who are showing symptoms, often severe symptoms, are going to be the ones getting the tests, thus further distorting the data. Part 3, Gates said a vaccine can be created in less than 18 months with a data-based approach and rapid trials. The federal government should help build facilities where the vaccines will be made. Now, will Amazon and Facebook need quarantining after COVID-19? Writes Lionel Laurent in Bloomberg, March the 30th. In fact, he says, we may already be seeing the contours of a new post-virus grand bargain between big tech and big state. It says something that the most high-profile move from the European Union in recent weeks has been to ask the bosses of Netflix and Alphabet's Google and YouTube to throttle streaming quality to reduce internet congestion. The EU's technocrats in Brussels, the land of sweeping data privacy laws, are now eyeing the use of smartphone geolocation metadata, anonymized, of course. Yes, of course, to monitor the outbreak. Digital rules designed to boost the EU's technological sovereignty are being rethought, the Financial Times reports. What the current crisis has emphasized is how much of what the tech industry's billionaire-run corporations provide resemble essential public or quasi-public goods and services. As the virus has shut schools, libraries, and public parks in some cities, those spaces have moved online. Information, education, and healthcare in these times are overwhelmingly reliant on the internet and by extension dependent on the FANG firms and Microsoft, which of last year accounted for more than 40% of all traffic. It's hard to imagine the genie will be put back in the bottle. Even once countries lift lockdowns, big tech will retain its power, which is why when we emerge from self-isolation to build the post-COVID-19 society, we can't just return to the earlier status quo. The virus has already prompted governments across the world to rethink where the fire hose of financial stimulus should be aimed at an emergency, with trillions in aid going to support workers, hospitals, and the unemployed, not just big business. A similar rethink is due for tech platforms. So I guess the good news is that Facebook, Google, Microsoft, etc., they're going to be even more powerful than they were previously, because apparently it's been decided that society must be utterly destroyed. I'm reminded, I'm going to be talking about the movie Singles, Cameron Crowe's movie from 1992, and tomorrow. And one of the lead characters, played by Campbell Scott, he remarks that, that it's really quite amazing that there's hardly ever a need to leave your house or anything. Now, see, the joke is that he is living in absolute squalor and he is about as depressed as a man can be. But even in 1992, yes, no need to leave your house. Why would you want to have anything to do with other people? Other people are dangerous. Other people will kill you. Other people will drive across state and provincial boundaries for the sole purpose, one supposes, of infecting others. Other people are hell, and so they cannot be permitted to have any autonomy. Well, one of the skeptics is Toby Young, as previously mentioned, and he has a piece on the Critic Co. UK called "Has the Government Overreacted to the Coronavirus Crisis?" Like a growing number of people, I'm beginning to suspect the government has overacted. I'm not talking about the cost to our liberty, although that's worrying, but the economic cost. Even if we accept the statistical modeling of Dr. Neil Ferguson's team at Imperial College, which I'll come to in a minute, spending £350 billion to prolong the lives of a few 100,000 mostly elderly people is an irresponsible use of taxpayers' money. That may sound cold-hearted, but this isn't a straightforward trade-off between public health and economic health. People are killed by economic downturns just as surely as they are by pandemics, and more years of life will be lost than saved if the lockdown is prolonged. The government should end it as soon as possible and encourage people to return to work, limiting social distancing measures to the elderly and those with underlying health conditions. Let's begin by assuming Imperial College's numbers are correct. On March 16th, Dr. Ferguson's team predicted there would be 510,000 fatalities if the government did nothing, 250,000 if it continued with its mitigation strategy, and 20,000 if it switched to suppression. In other words, 230,000 lives would be saved if the government locked everyone down. These are the numbers that persuaded Boris Johnson and the cabinet to switch tack. So at its simplest, the government has valued each life at 1.5 million pounds. That's 350 billion pounds divided by 230,000 people. Now, that's almost certainly over-egging it. The Imperial College team maintained 250,000 would die if everyone who required medical treatment received it, which they wouldn't because the NHS lacks the capacity to treat that many people. In addition, there wouldn't be zero economic cost to mitigation, which involves home quarantining of suspect cases and those living in the same households, and social distancing of the elderly and others most at risk. Rishi Sunak would need to take some measures to offset those costs as well. Finally, the 350 billion pounds the Chancellor is committed to bailing out the economy isn't a complete write-off. 330 billion of it takes the form of government-backed loans, and some of those will be repaid. So let's just adjust the denominator upwards to say 370,000 and the numerator downwards to say 185 billion pounds. That yields a cost per life of £500,000. Is that high? That depends on how many years of life you're adding to each of the people saved. The National Institute for Clinical Excellence, which decides which new drugs and medical procedures to fund, places a value of up to £30,000 on each quality-adjusted life year. That is, when evaluating how to spend taxpayers' money on saving lives, NICE says we should be spending no more than £30,000 to add 1 year of perfect health to one person. How many QALYs will the government be adding to those people whose lives would otherwise be lost to coronavirus if the lockdown hadn't been imposed? For is it worth spending £500,000 per life? Using this evaluation criterion, the answer would have to be about 16.5, and that seems optimistic, given that the average age of those who've died from the virus in the UK to date is 79.5. I'm going to repeat that. The average age of Britons who have died, the deaths attributed to coronavirus, is 79.5. And average UK life expectancy is just short of 81. This suggests the lockdown is extending the lives of 370,000 people by an average of less than 1.5 years. Of course, the average age of coronavirus fatalities would be younger if the critical care capacity of the National Health Service was overwhelmed, which it would be 8 times over if we had struck with mitigation, according to Dr. Ferguson. Remember, 79.5 is the average age of those patients the NHS is unable to save in the current circumstances. The independent researcher Noah Carl has calculated that the average number of life years added to each of the people who would have died if we'd continued with mitigation is 11. But even if we assume those are 11 years of perfect health, not the case. Since the majority of people who die of COVID-19 have underlying health conditions, we are still overvaluing those lives, since NICE would price those 11 years at £330,000, not £500,000. Before we get on to the number of life years that will be lost as a result of the lockdown, it's worth pointing out that if the government is prepared to spend £185 billion to extend life, it could have done it in dozens of ways that would have yielded more. For instance, it could have increased the NHS's annual budget by $18.5 billion for the next 10 years. That is, sticking with mitigation and spending the £185 billion the Chancellor is spending on offsetting the impact of suppression on the NHS would almost certainly have saved more lives. Okay, what about the loss of life caused by the inevitable economic recession? And I don't think we're talking about a recession here. I think we're talking about a depression. 30% unemployment, that's a depression. In the Great Depression of the 1930s in the United States, it reached 25%. During this crisis, politicians have had an annoying habit of contrasting the sacred value of human life with secular economic values and asserting that it would be morally unacceptable to trade off the former against the latter. Thus, Rishi Sunak repeatedly said he would do whatever it takes to save lives, while New York's Governor Andrew Cuomo said, "I'm not willing to put a price on a human life." Setting aside the fact that policymakers frequently do put a price on human life. When deciding how to allocate health resources, for instance, these high-sounding pronouncements ignore the fact that economic downturns cost lives. The choice politicians are making is not between saving lives and economic growth, but between sacrificing lives now and sacrificing them in the future. Being politicians, they plumped for short-termism, but they shouldn't pretend that's an act of great moral courage. When economies contract, life expectancy declines due to, among other things, a rise in poverty, violent crime, and suicide. During the global financial crisis of 2007 to 2009, the suicide rate in the United States increased by 4.8%, according to the Centers for Disease Control, and in Europe by 6.5%, according to the World Health Organization. Philip Thomas, professor of risk management at Bristol University, has calculated that if the UK's GDP falls by more than 6.4% per person as a result of the lockdown, many more years of life will be lost than saved, using Dr. Ferguson's estimates. Thomas points out that GDP per head fell by 6% in the UK during that financial crash, and many economists are predicting the negative impact of the lockdown will be at least twice as large. In light of these considerations, it would be unwise for the government to extend the lockdown for a further 6 months, as reported in Monday's papers. On the contrary, it shouldn't extend it beyond the scheduled 3 weeks, i.e. bring it to an end on April 14th, the day after Easter Monday. If it must extend, it should only do so for 1 week, enabling schools to reopen on April the 20th. Admittedly, that will be politically difficult if it results in the NHS being overwhelmed and the television news starts broadcasting nightly footage of patients dying in hotel corridors. But it may be that Dr. Ferguson and his team have overestimated the demand for ICU beds. The Imperial College model assumes that the case fatality rate is 0.9%, but that number may be too high. We know the denominator, the number of COVID-19 deaths, but not the numerator, the number of people who've been infected. According to another study carried out by a team at Oxford University, it's possible that half the UK population have already been infected. If that's true, not only does it mean that the CFR is lower than 0.9%, Dr. J. Bhattacharya of Stanford believes it's closer to 0.1%. It also means that the country is well on its way to acquiring herd immunity, and the much ballyhooed peak that we've been trying to avoid by locking ourselves down won't materialize. It's also worth bearing in mind that Dr. Ferguson revised his estimates of the NHS's surge capacity downwards in the March 16th report, and that may have been unduly cautious given how well the NHS has responded to the crisis in the 2 weeks since. Even so, the government may still be unwilling to take the risk, or rather it may be unwilling to risk taking a decision that will mean a rise in visible deaths, even though prolonging the lockdown will inevitably mean a greater number of invisible deaths. Some people reading this will think, I bet he changes his tune if he gets the virus. In fact, I've got the virus. I became symptomatic 7 days ago, have been bedridden ever since, and am now anxiously waiting to see if the disease spreads to my lungs. I'm 56 with no underlying health conditions, so my odds are good. But if the government follows my advice and it turns out by the time I require urgent care, the NHS cannot accommodate me, I won't regret writing this. Yes, I probably have at least 20 years of healthy living ahead of me, so my life is worth more than £500,000, but I'll be the exception. In the unlikely event of the NHS being overwhelmed, the majority of people whose lives could have been saved only have 1 or 2 years left, and those will not be good years. It isn't worth spending $185 billion to save them, nor is it worth a 15% drop in GDP, which will result in a greater loss of life. My death would be acceptable collateral damage. Well, I would have thought it'd be obvious to any intelligent person that trade-offs with regard to health and fatalities are made all the time. You want to reduce deaths in automobile accidents? Well, get the government to buy everyone the best cars, the safest cars. That would cost an enormous amount of money. I mean, that could be done. There's all sorts of things that could be done. All sorts of things. How about live-in carers with all old people paid for by the government? You know, to help them down the stairs, all that sorts of thing. My point is that these trade-offs are just common. They're understood, but now we're pretending that we don't We don't understand them. We've never heard of them, and that it was wicked. It's wicked to even speak of trade-offs. Another skeptic is Andrew Lilico in The Telegraph. He says Britain needs to have a less cowardly debate about the lockdown trade-off development. He begins, the UK government has enacted unprecedented suppression measures. The population are kept in their homes. We are allowed only out for necessary purposes, which do not, for example, include dating. We are not permitted to meet others, to trade, to worship, to sing, to drink, to play sports, for hobby crafts, to be educated, or almost another of the other vast web of activities that constitute ordinary daily lives outside the home. Even travel for work is not permitted unless that work is crucial. This is an incredible curtailment of human freedom. The welfare costs of this are vast. I do not mean simply the GDP costs, though those in themselves are enormous. I mean the cost of lost enjoyment, lost advance in our skills, lost spiritual development, lost self-expression, delayed marriages, missing of windows of opportunity to ever have a baby, missing the chance to sit at the bedside of a loved one dying of cancer. There are those who say any cost is worth it if it saves a single life, but that is obviously preposterous. Even if doing so did not mean no extra deaths in itself, we would not ban all hobbies, dating, and conviviality in the country for months or years just to save a single life. These other forms of human activity have a value in themselves, which is not simply to be waved away as irrelevant when compared with a life. And once we recognize and accept that we would not and should not do all this to save a single life, the inevitable question is, well, if not one, how many? For all that people quail at such questions, any policymaker unwilling to confront such a predicament is not being compassionate, but cowardly. Policymakers should care about people's hobby making, worship, dating, friendly banter, and sports, as well as their being alive at all. These other things are not worthless when compared to lives. Now, it can be very challenging to compare unlike things. How much freedom is worth a life? But economists who work on policy making engage with such questions all the time. Often the way they do that is by converting both the freedom and the lives into a common numerical unit. Often that unit is money. I'll give you a concrete example. Some years ago, I led a study for the European Union considering its rules on chemicals in toys. If we made the rules more restrictive, fewer children would die, but it would become more expensive to produce the toys, so fewer poor children would get toys. I had to devise ways to help policymakers trade off the risk of more child deaths versus fewer poor children getting toys at all, so as to find the optimal compromise. I do not accept my devising such a calculus was callous. Similar principles must apply in our current situation. I'm not an expert in the progression of viral diseases, but I can tell you how to work out whether, if restrictive measure A would save 50,000 lives, and some even more restrictive measure would save 100,000 lives, that it is worth doing. What we are doing is overturning our whole society for at least months and possibly years. That will involve a huge fall in GDP, and that may mean suppression proves infeasible over the medium term. But the GDP costs here are only a small portion of the total social costs of these restrictions. That is not simply a matter for virologists, where we listen to the experts and do as we are instructed. It is a matter for the whole of society to debate regarding the trade-offs involved. Well, it turns out that there essentially was not a debate. That what the politicians said, this is an emergency such as our countries have never faced, and action must be taken now. Imperial College has a computer model based on thousands of lines of undocumented C code, wrote more than 13 years ago. So that means the full apparatus of totalitarianism. So there is literally no time to have a debate. This is what has happened all over the Western world. Lilico continues, avoiding, say, 1 million deaths might well justify keeping us locked down for 18 months, and keeping us locked down for only 3 months might well be justified for a much lower number of deaths. But the government needs to spell out what it sees as the costs, time and intensity of lockdown, and benefits, number of lives otherwise lost, numbers of people who would otherwise survive but with compromised lungs. This demand for the government to spell it out is not mere ghoulish fascination. Partly it is because social compliance with restrictions will be much higher if people believe they may not go on for a long, and if they do go on for a long time, they are avoiding perhaps 1 million deaths, possibly including their own and many others with compromised health. But more than that, it is vital for our future liberty. Many people seem to believe these measures are saving tens of thousands of lives and are justified on that basis. If the government leaves us with the impression that all this would be worth it to save, say, 50,000 lives, there is a risk that some future government would use these events as a precedent to impose similar restrictions when indeed there were only 50,000 lives at stake. Yes, a Rubicon has been crossed here, and the governments have gotten away with this, and there is nothing stopping them in the past from claiming that there is some other crisis which requires the loss of all freedoms. Indeed, freedom is dangerous. By its nature, freedom is dangerous, so perhaps it will be decided that there won't be any more freedom. He concludes, mundane, innocent daily pleasures are not worthless compared to lives. We should stand up for them and insist that if they are to be sacrificed, as perhaps this time they must be, that has to be because there is a huge amount at stake and a realistic chance of getting it. The government needs to state explicitly that it is so this time. Well, as Peter Hitchens has been pointing out, there are not yet restrictions on speech that is critical of the totalitarian measures taken by governments, but that might be coming. We might be hearing a lot more about misinformation, which again, I will remind you, simply means opinions which are not elite opinions. Someone responding to Peter Hitchens on Twitter today said, "It's noted you never give alternative approach, so assume you're fine with the consequences of continuing as normal, and you have the details of the study of the impact in doing so, which assume you have undertaken." He responds, "I don't understand this comment. I clearly want the shutdown to end immediately. It is like watching mad surgeons cut the limbs off a healthy patient. All you want is for it to stop." And the Off Guardian, which has been very valuable in these dark days, has another piece on COVID-19. Could the COVID-19 response be more deadly than the virus? This is a piece by Kevin Ryan. He says the initial alarming estimates of deaths from COVID-19 were that as many as 2.2 million people would die in the United States. This number is comparable to the annual U.S. death rate of around 3 million. Fortunately, correction of some simple errors and overestimation has begun to dramatically reduce the virus mortality claims. The most recent estimate from the leading U.S. authority on COVID-19 suggests that the U.S. may see between 100,000 and 200,000 deaths, with the final tally likely to be somewhere in the middle. This means we are expecting about 150,000 U.S. deaths caused by the virus if the latest estimates hold up. How does that compare to the effects of the measures taken in response? By all accounts, the impact of the response will be great, far-reaching, and long-lasting. To better assess the difference, we might ask how many people will die as a result of the response to COVID-19. Although a comprehensive analysis is needed from those experienced with modeling mortality rates, we can begin to estimate by examining existing research and comparative statistics. Let's start by looking at three critical areas of impact: suicide and drug abuse, lack of medical treatment or coverage, and poverty and food access. According to the National Center for Health Statistics, over 48,000 suicides occurred in the U.S. in 2018. This equates to an annual rate of about 14 suicides per 100,000 people. As expected, suicides increased substantially during times of economic depression. For example, as a result of the 2008 recession, there was an approximate 25% increase. Similarly, during the peak year of the Great Depression in 1932, the rate rose to 17 suicides per 100,000 people. Recent research ties high suicide rates to, quote, the unraveling of the social fabric, unquote, which happens when societal breakdowns occur. People become despondent over economic hardship, the loss of social structures, loneliness, and related factors. There's probably no greater example of these kinds of losses than what we are experiencing today with the extreme response to COVID-19. The social structures might return in a few months, but the economy will not. Some think that the economy will recover in 3 years, and others think it will never recover in terms of impact to low-income households, as was the case for the 2008 recession. However, if we estimate a full recovery in 6 years, the effects will contribute about 3 suicides per 100,000 people every year during that time, for a total of over 59,000 deaths in the United States. Related to suicides are drug abuse deaths. According to the National Institute on Drug Abuse, over 67,000 deaths from overdose of illicit or prescription drugs occurred in 2018. This does not include alcohol abuse. Only 7% were suicides, and 87% were known to be unintentional deaths, largely due to drug abuse caused by depression or other mental conditions. Such conditions can be expected to rise during times of economic collapse. And if we estimate the impact due to COVID-19 over 6 years as being a 25% increase, as with suicides, that projects about 87,000 additional deaths due to drug abuse. And then he goes on to talk about the lack of medical coverage or treatment. And poverty and food access. The Columbia University School of Public Health studied the effects of poverty on death rates. The investigators found that 4.5% of U.S. deaths were attributable to poverty. That's about 130,000 deaths annually. How will this be affected by COVID-19? One way to begin estimating is to consider how the number of people living in poverty will increase. Although deaths due to poverty are not entirely about food access, it is a significant factor in that category. In times of economic hardship, many people can't afford good food, causing malnutrition and, in some cases, starvation. People also can't access food, causing the same outcomes. Limited access to nutritious food is a root cause of diet-related diseases, including diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and infant mortality issues. A recent estimate suggests 20% of all deaths worldwide are linked to poor diets. Food access issues will be further exacerbated with the COVID-19 problem due to the anticipated issues with food production and prices. If the COVID-19 response lasts for years as expected, our estimate will need to be a multiple of the 130,000 annual figure. Using the 6-year estimate, we get 780,000 additional deaths. It's really simple. The government says we are undertaking a policy which is going to lead to this consequence. Well, what are the other consequences? We're not going to get into that. Why aren't you going to get into it? I suspect because they really haven't thought about it. And 2, because if they were to speak about it, then a large number of people might say, hey, wait a minute. Is this really prudent? You know, instead of people running around with their hair on fire like Robin Urbach saying that, oh, no, people still have too much freedom. There are people, leaving their homes. They're still leaving their homes. There are businesses still operating which are not truly essential. So let's see what is going on in the chat. Yako Raipala says, in my family, people regularly live to over 90. Some have actually gone to 100. But at that point, people are barely conscious. It would make little difference if Corona were to cut off a few years. I've talked previously, I believe on this stream, about these projections by experts that if certain measures are taken, average human longevity could be raised to, say, 150. And I believe I've expressed my belief that this would lead to just astronomical rate of suicide. And furthermore, it would lead to, well, mass terror in our society. Because, if you are going to live to 150, then why would you undertake anything which might be considered dangerous? I mean, people would be afraid to cross the street. Again, imagine losing your job at the age of 100. and oh God, I got another 30 years of work left. Imagine being on your eighth or ninth, marriage at the age of 130. It's all, it's all preposterous. The rich people believe that the use of young people's blood and such like will permit this. I mean, a lot of people are really serious about this. But we know that when people get to the age of 80, I mean, there are some people who are still active. There are some people who are still sane. I mentioned my father, who's in a long-term health care facility. He was active and sane into his 88th year, and that's 18 more than the fabled 70. I can hardly see that anyone would be in a position to complain about that. Humans have a genetically determined lifespan. That is my belief. I'm just merely stating that experts continually trot out the idea that human longevity can be extended to 150. Again, I think that it's written in our DNA that we have to conk out by a certain age. For a lot of people over the age of 70, even people over the age of 75, their lives are miserable. They are lonely. No one is interested in them. They suffer from recurring diseases, all manner of things. There is no, I don't understand this idea that there is an inherent good in extending human life indefinitely. Okay, a whole bunch of talk about Melchi. I don't know who that is. Okay, a bunch of talk about a live stream, which is not this live stream. Ricky Bullock says, I think a lot of the overreaction might come down to boomer privilege. All the people making the decisions are high risk. Yes, as I've said, this panic is a fatal conjunction between boomer millennialism and matriarchal consensus. That a lot of the boomers seriously seem to harbor a belief that if the right medical decisions are made and the scientists, the pharmaceutical companies, pull the finger out, then a drug which will be devised such that they can live forever, or at least they can still do all of those. They can be hang gliding when they're 100 years old. That sort of thing. Okay, so let's get back to what we were talking about. And I mentioned Peter Hitchens. Well, the Daily Beast. What if the coronavirus lockdown is only the beginning? This is a nightmare we're living through. Okay, human liberties have been mostly suspended, but that's temporary, right? And it's not going to get any worse than this. Well, apparently it has to get much worse, and it's never going to end. This is a piece by Lynn Peoples. It's like a fire. You have to keep suppressing it, one expert said. Do you see how sinister this has become? That we're never going to have any liberty ever again because of a computer model from Imperial College London, which is thousands of lines of undocumented C code from over 13 years ago. I mean, societies collapse for all sorts of reasons, but computer model, there was a recurring theme on the HBO series of Silicon Valley, which I'm very fond of, that the neural net, which was part of the program that they were developing, that that it was heuristic, and it was made very, very fast because of compression, and this was going to lead to the Terminator syndrome. Everybody dies, but the world is coming to an end, or has come to an end, because of a old model, computer model, a black box, because Ferguson won't share his code, a black box from Imperial College London. I wouldn't have chosen that, but that's where we've ended up. Story begins in Seattle. Strips of red tape 6 feet apart line the sidewalk outside the walk-up window at Chocolati Cafe. Business is steady on this sunny Sunday despite the tables and chairs stacked up inside. 3 baristas scramble to keep up with orders from an array of customers that stretches out more than 30 feet. Gordy Glass has just ordered his 8-ounce latte. He's on his way to walk a lap of Green Lake across the street. I do this almost every day now, Glass 45 said. I'm running out of things to do at home. At the lake, a steady stream of walkers, runners, skaters, and bikers share the 3-mile path with gaggles of geese. Here, too, most people, if not the congregating geese, are adhering to the international trend towards social distancing. A reminder is posted by the trail: stay 6 feet or at least arm's length away from others. But what was a sort of Northwestern curiosity as recently as a few weeks ago may not only outlast the wishes of GDP-fixated politicians like Donald Trump. Oh, GDP-fixated politicians. Yeah, this is how you describe a man who doesn't want the American economy wrecked. This may also become a regular, that is, intermittent fact of American life. Taken together, recent COVID-19 forecasts suggest Americans should be ready not just for a months-long shutdown, but to also potentially return to the practice again. Yes, the price of matriarchy is eternal panic. In other words, some epidemiologists, and don't you just love epidemiologists? I mean, you've probably never even heard the word, or most people have never heard the term epidemiologist. Now, well, I was listening to this epidemiologist, and he said, well, there's this other epidemiologist, and other scientists closely studying the pandemic increasingly seem to be veering towards a long-term, multi-layered approach, including repeated periods of social distancing. It's almost as if I can hear people committing suicide, because man is a social animal, but we are told that, no, that's not necessary. There's no reason to leave the house. Everything you want is on the internet. Entertainment, education, porn, it's all there. People do not need people. This is what we are being told. New data suggests the social distancing efforts have slightly slowed the rate of increase in COVID-19 infections in Washington state. That there's hope here. We have to hammer this until we can be assured it will not spring back up, said Governor Jay Inslee. Well, again, there's no evidence whatsoever, and there couldn't be any evidence that this social distancing is having a positive effect, because we have the numerator, but we do not have the denominator, and we are not going to get the denominator for quite some time, if ever, because of a shortage of tests. And this goes on and on. Oh, worst case scenario, according to the models, is 2 years of cycled social distancing. Suffice to say, that might be a tough sell. The public's acceptance of this kind of shutdown 2 or 3 times does not seem likely, says Howard Markle of the University of Michigan's Center for the History of Medicine. We're buying time until a vaccine, said Juliette Kayyem, faculty chairwoman of the Homeland Security Project at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. I'm not going to repeat anything more from what Juliette Kayyem has to say, because the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard is one of the fonts of evil in the world. Another remaining open question is whether or not people who recover from the virus could be susceptible to it later on. We should not yet count on herd immunity. Says one scientist, we should count on social distancing. It will help us now in the future. A lot of people are supposedly given the all clear from cancer, and then they get cancer again. But I guess COVID-19 is worse than cancer. We're supposed to be more frightened of it than cancer. I guess what? It never goes away. Yes, viruses never go away. There's always new ones. The story ends. How about the impact of the selected measures instituted at a place like Green Lake Park? A sign attached to the barrier that blocks entrance to one of the Green Lake parking lots explains that the closure is to reduce park use and help slow the spread of the COVID-19 virus. Along the lake's perimeter, Yellow tape wards people away from a children's playground, exercise equipment, and swimming pool. Tape also spans from hoop to hoop down the length of an outdoor basketball court. The park's tennis courts remain open and in full use. Oh dear. Oh dear. Oh dear. What? People are still playing tennis? It's just, there's a picture of Lynn Peeps here, as she is. Yeah, these are our betters. Ashley Frawley writes in Spiked, why the left loves a disaster. Well, yeah, it's a funny thing ascribing this panic to the left, because there's an awful lot of people supposedly on the right who are loving this disaster, and a great many people who have sworn their allegiance to liberty, the Constitution, various constitutions, freedom. It turns out that they don't give a toss about it. That at the whiff of danger, we can't have freedom anymore. It is too dangerous. I would say that the right is as susceptible, has shown itself to be as susceptible to this panic as the left. But in any event, one persistent response to the UK government's attempts to grapple with the COVID-19 outbreak is to lament its apparent reluctance to take ever more drastic measures. Unsurprisingly, opposition Labour ministers have been leading this charge, calling for tougher compliance measures to stem the tide of infection. Labour wants the government to stop asking people not to go to work unless they have to, and instead to shut down any non-essential businesses, compelling people to stay indoors. Much as it irks the Libertarians, writes the Labour-supporting Gabby Hinsliff in The Guardian, the state will have to prescribe in much more heavy-handed detail what we can and can't do. Yet the government itself still seems to be coming to terms with that new reality. Yeah, who died and made her dictator? Hinsliff's is a widely echoed complaint. Critics from the wider Labour left have complained that the government's unenforced advice and hesitancy in imposing restrictions has wasted valuable time and will no doubt cost many lives. To them, a state-enforced lockdown just makes sense. It's a no-brainer. And so we have an ostensibly surprising situation in which those on the left are completely at ease with calls for public health measures to be wielded with an iron fist. Peter Hitchens is the author of a book called The Phony War, which I reviewed on the book club some months ago, and he talks about the mythos of Britain in World War II. Well, if we were to look at Britain's experience in World War II through the lens, as the kids are saying, of the contemporary situation, then obviously Britain should have simply told Hitler just to do whatever he wanted. Why would Britain get involved? Because people are going to die. Our soldiers are going to die on the battlefield, and our civilians are going to die from bombs. So if life at all costs, any cost, is the highest virtue, then when someone suggests, you must do this or we will invade you, well, then you must do it. And if it's a choice between invasion and being conquered and resistance, well, then it would be immoral to choose resistance to invasion and being conquered, because that would result in deaths. I mean, the whole question of honor, what a sickening notion. Honor gets people killed. Probe a little deeper, and the alliance between the contemporary left and an authoritarian state is not that much of a surprise. That's because many on the left have long been all too comfortable with calls for the state to regulate our behavior. Indeed, so-called progressives have been complaining that governments are not doing enough to curtail freedoms, especially when it comes to health risks, for 2 decades at least. They complain that people still stubbornly fail to adopt healthy behaviors, that they eat the wrong foods and enjoy the wrong lifestyles. This active distrust of the public has underpinned the gradual decades-long shift in public health strategy, from public information campaigns toward more subtly coercive measures. Our freedom, such as it is, has been treated as little more than an obstacle to be overcome in the quest for health and well-being. But the COVID-19 crisis has exposed something else about the left. That is, its illiberalism goes hand in hand with a yearning for catastrophe. This isn't as counterintuitive as it seems. In fact, it makes sense. The contemporary left believes that people's freedom is a problem because people make the wrong decisions. They eat the wrong food. They enjoy the wrong lifestyles, and post-New Labor, they even vote the wrong way. Through their freedom, then, people are effectively bringing disaster upon themselves. They are the vehicles of the coming apocalypse. It was as if some were just waiting for something like this to happen, and now the pandemic is here, they can tweet their sighs of relief. One researcher noted that his social media posts offering pessimistic scenarios are shared much more enthusiastically than his reassuring ones. Many, he remarks, seem to want this epidemic to turn into a catastrophe. Well, I'm reminded that C.S. Lewis once wrote that truly the end will have come when we no longer believe in God, but still believe in the devil. And we don't believe in God on the whole. Or if we do believe in God, it's only as a kind of health and happiness regime. But we certainly believe in the devil as seen in the form of nuclear winter or climate emergency or coronavirus panic. Sweden has resisted the demands to lock down society. There's another piece from Spike, David Eberhard. Apparently it's a big debate. We know the Prime Minister is not happy with Sweden's relatively laissez-faire approach, and the leading newspaper in that country is almost hysterical. This fellow wrote a book 15 years ago called In the Land of the Security Junkie about Sweden's excessive fascination with safety and security. It became a bestseller in the Nordic region. Now, suddenly, as a result of the coronavirus pandemic, a great deal has changed in a very short period of time throughout the Western world, and my reflections have become more relevant than ever. There is at present considerable anxiety about a virus that in some cases may be fatal, but for the vast majority of us is virtually harmless. Based on what has happened in Italy, it has become clear that older people in general, and particularly those with other underlying illnesses, are extremely overrepresented among the most seriously affected. This group must, of course, be protected as much as possible, but closing down the whole of society, as the vast majority of Sweden's neighboring countries have done, is a strategy with neither rhyme nor reason to it. I'll just point out that if you seriously want to live for a long time, other things being equal, get thin. Your thinness is the best indicator of how long you will live. It's that simple. And it is no surprise that over 70% of those people in ICU units, this was reported last week, British ICU units have a body mass index of over 25. Curious thing, I noticed a curious thing in my own city of Victoria last week, and apparently it's everywhere. It's not just that businesses are closed, is that they are boarded up with plywood. And well, I'll get to the situation in Vancouver Island, but we were about as far from a panic, or we were about as far from the conditions which would justify a panic as possible. And yet, as I reported yesterday, it seemed to be about 85% of businesses in downtown Victoria were closed, and a great many of them, including a tapas bar and a gym, are boarded up. Who would loot such places? But this is from Zero Hedge. Retailers prepare for civil unrest. Boarded up stores seen from Soho to Beverly Hills. High-end stores across the country have been boarding up their stores in anticipation of civil unrest due to the Chinese coronavirus pandemic. In Beverly Hills, the Pottery Barn and West Elm stores near Rodeo Drive were spotted with boards across the windows, according to TMZ. Meanwhile, stores in New York, San Francisco, Seattle, Chicago, Paris, Vancouver, and elsewhere were similarly boarded up. Is there something they know that the rest of us don't? Is some purge-related plan that's been revealed to them? The economist, Zingales, he tweets, the Magnificent Mile in Chicago today. It looks like Chile in November. All fancy stores boarded up. Are they afraid of COVID-19 or of something else? Well, I think we got a pretty good idea of what they are afraid of. I don't know that I need to spell it out to you. San Francisco looks like a town expecting a hurricane, with storefronts boarded up and people lining up at stores, while others wander around without any apparent destination or plan, as if propelled by Brownian motion. Everyone is waiting for Hurricane COVID-19 to crest. In Canterbury, okay, boarded up. I wouldn't have thought Canterbury would be a particularly violent town. And there are pictures here from all over the world. So, I don't know, is the revolution coming? Are the road wars about to start? Now, we haven't really been hearing all that much about climate emergency, as I mentioned, but also intersectionality has taken a huge blow from COVID-19. If the end of the world is coming, and if millions are going to die, it turns out that people don't really care about intersectionality. It's just all made up. This from Paul Kersey in VDARE. Black Baltimore councilman says implicit bias of white doctors is a greater threat to the Black community than coronavirus. If you've read The City That Bleeds, Race, History, and the Death of Baltimore, you know the truth about Baltimore. Our elite have spent more than half a century trying to explain away as the fault of pernicious white people and their insidious redlining, systemic racism, and a racial criminal justice system. Now, somehow, in a city completely dominated by Black elected and appointed officials, the consequences of the China virus pale in comparison to white racism, implicit bias, and structural inequalities and the residue of white supremacy. Because in the eyes of elected Black officials, nefarious white people and the implicit bias of white healthcare professionals is the true dilemma facing the Black community as the coronavirus rages across Maryland. Lawmakers push for a racial breakdown in Maryland's public coronavirus data, seek to spot disparities early, where they're going to get these disparities because Black people in the United States are fat. There, I said it. It's true. Some 10 years ago, I was informed from a reliable source that the average weight of a Black woman in the United States is 174 pounds. And we're talking about a group of people whose average height is 5'4". There are dangerously high rates of diabetes, hypertension, etc. amongst Black people. So yes, they are going to be disproportionately hit by coronavirus, and they are going to blame white people for it. Again, Steve Stahler reports Liz Warren demands corona reporting by race. My suspicion that the authorities decided a long time ago to ixnay reporting by race during epidemics to avoid stigmatizing the marginalized, but now U.S. Democratic lawmakers call for racial data in virus testing. In a letter sent Friday to Health and Human Services Secretary Alex Azar, Senator Elizabeth Warren and Representative Ayanna Pressley, both from Massachusetts, said comprehensive demographic data on people who are tested or treated for the virus that causes COVID-19 does not exist. Over the weekend, cities with large Black and non-white Hispanic population emerged as new hotspots for the spread of the virus. Well, I've already explained why that is the case, and I think that most people understand this, except that it's unacceptable that we can't hold people responsible for the consequences of their actions. And, morbid obesity is not a disease. It is a chosen lifestyle. That said, I understand, before people complain in the chat, that the food companies are working assiduously and have worked assiduously for decades to turn food into a kind of drug through the use of, corn syrup and the like. I get that. I get that. So food is more delicious than it has ever been before, but that doesn't mean you just can't stop eating. Certainly at a point when you're full. Oh yes, there's something that I missed yesterday, and I must apologize for this. Elizabeth Warren tweeted yesterday, This Trans Day of Visibility, I want all trans and non-binary people to know you are valued, you are loved, and that we will keep fighting to make sure that you can live freely, safely, and openly, exactly where you are. Yes, it's good to be reminded of what the real priorities are. John Derbyshire in VDARE reports that the Chinese communists are whipping up anti-Americanism. Mrs. Derbyshire is on WeChat, the Chi-Com approved and monitored social medium used by most mainland Chinese. A current strong theme on WeChat is crowing about how America, having unleashed COVID-19 on the world, that is the official Chi-Com government line, is now suffering deaths from the blowback. A great many Chinese people are delighted by this. Many more aren't, but they are thinly represented on WeChat. Personal friends of mine over there who post pretty regularly on WeChat and who are smart enough to doubt the Chi-Com line are mostly silent. Whether they are being diplomatically silent or their posts are being canceled, I don't know. For sure, anti-Americanism is running strong over there. Here's a WeChat post suggesting that a factory making those handheld forehead thermometers for export to the USA should deliberately miscalibrate them to make money and harm Americans. I have no idea whether the thing was actually done, but the post is getting gleeful support from other posters. We are dismayed to see how, after all these decades of lying, brutality, corruption, and mass murder, so many Chinese people still fall for the Communist Party line. Well, again, yes, we can mock the Chinese for their susceptibility to totalitarianism, but we've all embraced it, with very few exceptions, based on what? Someone pointing a gun at our head, threatening to throw us into the gulag, into the Lubyanka, to Dachau, or worse? No, we were told that this is what all right-thinking people believe, and if you don't believe it, you are an enemy of the people. Derbyshire concludes, perhaps when we get around to resetting our trading relations with Communist China, a good first move would be a mass boycott of Chinese goods. Most stuff marked made in China is garbage anyway, as Paul Midler has amply documented. Well, I have a personal example of this. I have a Denon amplifier, and I don't know, a couple of years ago, I guess about 3 years ago, the remote stopped working. And I didn't have the thing set up in my apartment for over a year, and I got it set up, I don't know, about a month ago, and then I found out, I was going to have to leave. But so I went searching on Amazon for remotes that would match, Denon remotes that would match the one that doesn't work anymore. And there was a whole bunch of vendors, and they were all from China, and basically about $15 it cost. So I ordered one. It arrived last week. I put 2 fresh new batteries in it, and it doesn't work. I'm not particularly surprised by that, merely a little disappointed. I've been to Walmart. I bought clothing there. I don't want to buy clothing from Walmart, from China, because you buy a pair of trousers and then you take them out of the washing machine after the 3rd wash, and you find out that the crotch is already beginning, it's already fraying, and that the pants are going to fall apart really quickly. Buying this cheap tat from China is a false economy. Again, Nicholas Sticks in VDARE says Russia hoax impeachment hoax didn't stop Trump, so New York Times tries anti-Asian hate crimes hoax. The New York Times story begins with Yuan Zhu, 26. She's been here just 5 years and lives in Chinese-friendly San Francisco. Pedestrian cursed and spit on her, she claims. He just looked like a normal person, she told the Times reporters, which invites the question of just how normal a person in the middle of an unhinged racial attack can look. He was yelling an expletive about China. Then a bus passed, she recalled, and he screamed after it, "Run them over." She tried to keep her distance, but when the light changed, she was stuck waiting with him at the crosswalk. Really? Why didn't she leave the crosswalk, the corner? That doesn't make a lot of sense. She could feel him staring at her and then suddenly she felt it, his saliva hitting her face and her favorite sweater. He sounds more like a wild-eyed nut to me, says Paul Kersey, but in any event, can you imagine the New York Times refusing to identify his race if he were white? I don't think so. My own conclusion, a black man attacked Madame Zhu, but readers never learn the race of any attacker in what we were led to believe is a coast-to-coast anti-Asian rampage. And Coulter's latest column, the bill for globalism has arrived. Tell China to pay it. When the after-action report on the current pandemic is being prepared, I'm going to ask the guy with the notepad to write down China and globalists. Those words won't be on Trump's list. He can't stop gushing about how much he respects China and the American companies that have outsourced jobs there. Even as China withholds vital medical supplies, he refuses to end our suicidal dependence on them. In Trump's defense, he's been fighting a trade war against China, and the Chinese are furious with him. And there is reason to believe that COVID-19 is the result of this. Too bad we shipped all our manufacturing to China. Not to worry, China wouldn't disrupt the sacred global supply chain. Oops, China is stockpiling masks and ventilators. And there's more good news. China makes more than 90% of our antibiotics, vitamin C, ibuprofen, and hydrocortisone, 70% of acetaminophen, and 40 to 45% of heparin, according to the New York Times. The last American penicillin plant closed more than 15 years ago. Well, there's no excuse for letting that happen, but it didn't happen under Trump's watch. And I very much hope and rather expect that manufacturing is going to be brought home. I mean, this sort of thing cannot be justified on a national security basis. Let's see. Here's an interesting story from Yahoo News. Suspected SARS virus and flu samples found in luggage. FBI report describes China's biosecurity risk. In late November 2018, just over a year before the first coronavirus case was identified in Wuhan, U.S. Customs and Border Protection agents at Detroit Metro Airport stopped a Chinese biologist with 3 vials labeled antibodies in his luggage. The biologist told the agents that a colleague in China had asked him to deliver the vials to a researcher at a U.S. institute. After examining the vials, however, custom agents came to an alarming conclusion. Inspection of the writing on the vials and the stated recipient led inspection personnel to believe the materials contained within the vials may be viable Middle East respiratory syndrome, MERS, and severe acute respiratory syndrome, SARS materials, says an unclassified FBI tactical intelligence report obtained by Yahoo News. Well, time to decouple, time for a cordon sanitaire. Yes, the whistleblower in China, Ai Fen, has gone incommunicado, believed detained after giving media interviews about her initial concerns over the coronavirus, according to an Australian media report. And again, I will remind people that what's going on in China right now is far worse than what happened in the Soviet Union, certainly after Khrushchev's secret speech in 1956. But apparently Russia is the bad country and not China. Why is that? Well, because there's a lot of money to be made dealing with China, and I suppose the Chinese aren't white people, so you get woke credits for that. And also because there are traitors in our midst, no question about it. Fifth columnists everywhere in the West. In Britain, Canada, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, and I hope these people. Well, I think it's a necessity for these people to be identified and then expelled. An interesting piece from Bloomberg: if the virus hadn't caused the crash, something else would have. This is by Satyajit Das. He says that shortfalls in revenue and cash flows caused by the shutdowns, COVID-19 shutdowns, have simply exposed the vulnerabilities of a structurally unsound economic and financial system. This is the same line taken by Jim Kunstler It's also my line for what it's worth. A fall in revenue is problematic, but manageable without debt. Unfortunately, in the aftermath of the 2008 crash, debt levels were increased rather than reduced, encouraged in part by low policy rates and the abundant liquidity engineered by central banks globally. Global debt as a percentage of GDP rose from about 250% in 2007 to 325% in 2019. Current debt levels are triple what they were in 1999. Businesses and households with declining or no income and high levels of borrowing now face an existential struggle to meet large financial commitments. A second problem is that in the everything bubble, asset prices were priced for perfection. Policymakers boosted the values of financial assets to increase economic activity via the wealth effect and to support borrowing to protect financial institutions. High asset prices reflected high leverage in the form of leveraged loans for private equity or structured investments such as collateralized loan obligations. Debt-financed share buybacks and distributions to shareholders inflated equity values by increasing earnings per share, but simultaneously raised corporate leverage. Toxic layers of debt were heavily exposed to significant revenue downturns. The weaknesses of the banking system were ignored. Regulatory rollbacks and tolerance for large dividends and capital buybacks undermined steps to strengthen bank capital and liquidity. In Europe and many emerging markets, non-performing loans were not appropriately recognized. The growth of the shadow banking sector was not checked. The current problems in the interbank market reflecting increased counterparty risk concerns are testament to these missteps. And finally, declines in trading liquidity were disregarded. In the search for returns, investors assumed liquidity risk, sometimes unwittingly. Redemption terms offered by investment funds to investors were inconsistent with their illiquid holdings. As traditional market makers reduced activity, market following structures such as ETFs and algorithmic traders were relied on for liquidity. In a crisis, these entities are users rather than providers of liquidity, as the current inability to trade even modest parcels of many securities go. With regard to debt, personal debt, a remarkable thing happened. That Adam Curtis has explained this, that particularly after 2008, we continue to be told that we could still have the things, the consumer goods, say, or the way of life that our parents or grandparents did. Well, how is that possible when we now live in a gig economy, when jobs are scarce, particularly good jobs, and benefits are slashed? How is it possible? Well, the banks will loan you the money. Well, this is grossly irresponsible, absolutely grossly irresponsible, but it was all an attempt to disguise the fact that the economy of the world was never going to be the same after 2008. But it was in everyone's interest, I suppose, politically and socially, to pretend that everything was going to be the same. And now we have a virus which kills a few thousand people at best, and it has utterly destroyed our economic system. There is some resistance to the totalitarianism. According to CBS News, Louisiana church packed for services again, despite charges against pastor amid pandemic. Let's see, buses and cars filled the Louisiana church parking lot for another service Tuesday evening as worshipers flocked to hear a Louisiana pastor who is facing misdemeanor charges for holding services despite a ban on gatherings amid the coronavirus pandemic. A few protesters turned out too, including a man shouting through a bullhorn against those gathering at the Life Tabernacle Church in the city of Central, where Pastor Tony Spell has been holding services. Another demonstrator held up a sign reading, "God don't like stupid." Well, it's a long debate about whether the very idea of God can be justified on a rational basis. Christians are taught that we live by faith. We live by the things that are not seen, as Jesus explained to doubting Thomas. Yeah, I mean, what do these things contribute? What does Christianity contribute? Well, apparently it means people getting together with other people, and that is a very bad thing. Social contact is wicked. From the Baltimore Sun, Baltimore pastor vows to continue services despite coronavirus-related restrictions and a visit to police. Once again, in the United States, the police are arresting people for holding religious services. A prominent pastor is vowing to hold worship services this Sunday and beyond after Baltimore police tried to shut down a service at his church. The Reverend Alvin Gwynn Sr. said he was delivering a sermon Sunday to 10 worshipers when 4 patrol cars containing 8 or 9 officers, 4 patrol cars, 8 or 9 officers pulled up in front of the Friendship Baptist Church, and several tried to enter the building. Gwynn, the longtime senior pastor of the church on Loch Raven Boulevard, said security guards prevented the officer's entry until he had finished his sermon. You should have seen it, man. It looked like a police raid on a drug deal. Well, I guess Christians they are the real criminals. That's one of the messages that we can take from the coronavirus panic, from the sanitary dictatorship. In Brazil, their President Bolsonaro said Monday that there can be no more quarantine measures imposed on the country than those already in place to combat coronavirus because jobs are being destroyed and the poor are suffering disproportionately. Speaking on TV, he criticized self-isolation and other measures imposed by local authorities to limit the spread of the virus, a view that again appeared to put him at odds with Health Minister Luiz Henrique Mandetta. Well, 3 cheers for President Bolsonaro. Yes, a report from Sweden here, but the National Post is seemingly aghast that in Sweden they have not as yet succumbed to the coronavirus panic. Are there going to be any free elections ever again in the United States? This is from Breitbart. Biden, states should prepare for remote voting in 2020 elections. He called on secretaries of state to plan for remote voting in the 2020 elections. There would be no rationale for eliminating or denying the election. It may be a virtual election. Biden also suggested drive-in voting as another possibility and predicted that there will be more absentee voting. Well, as far as virtual elections go, anyone who has ever followed any, say, leadership campaign vote that uses internet balloting, the systems always break down, and there are loud accusations after every vote of rampant fraud. Every single time. If you're going to use postal voting, well, we bring the fraud to you. That these votes will be commandeered by local hetman, and for a price, the right name will be entered, and then these votes will be harvested, as they say. This is one of the most terrifying aspects of this. The only way that you can have fair elections is for people to appear in person at balloting places on election day and fill out ballots, paper ballots, which are then counted and stored so that recounts can be held if necessary. We talk so much about the virtues of democracy, but we seem to have little interest in protecting democracy from those that would subvert it. So what's happening with the Cuomos? America's favorite bickering brothers. From Breitbart, Governor Andrew Cuomo on Tuesday told New Yorkers that his brother, Chris Cuomo, who recently tested positive for coronavirus, could have infected their mother, Matilda Cuomo, with the disease. Andrew said that his mother, age 88, was at Chris's house 2 weeks ago. I said, that was a mistake, the governor said during a press conference. I said, Chris, you can't have mom at the house. And he said, no. Mom is lonely. She wants to be at the house. I feel bad. She's cooped up in the apartment. Andrew recalled that he told his brother, you bring her to the house, you expose her to a lot of things. He said that his discussion with his brother helped him realize he needed to detail specific guidelines for older residents prompting him to create Matilda's Law. Andrew defended his brother as smart and informed, but noted that as an essential worker at CNN, he ran a higher risk of getting the virus. He's smart, he's social distancing, yes, but when you wind up exposing yourself, people wind up exposing you, and then they find out they're positive a couple of days later. Andrew also describes his brother Chris as a sweet guy, despite his demeanor on television. I don't think he's a sweet guy, and he's clearly not a bright fellow. Just your 88-year-old mother, really? Andrew Cuomo, born in 1957. Let's look at his personal life. According to Wikipedia, he married Carrie Kennedy, the seventh child of Robert and Ethel Kennedy, in 1990. They have 3 daughters. They separated in 2003 and divorced in 2005. He began dating Food Network host Sandra Lee in 2005, and the couple moved in together in 2011. The two resided in Westchester County. On September 25th, 2019, the couple announced that they had ended their relationship. On July 4th, 2015, Cuomo presided over the wedding ceremony of his longtime friend Billy Joel to his 4th wife, Alexis Roderick. Cuomo is a Roman Catholic. According to the New York Times, Cuomo's positions in favor of abortion and same-sex marriage and his cohabitation with Lee without marrying her, contrary to church teachings, have become a lightning rod in a decades-old culture war between conservative Catholics and those, like Mr. Cuomo, who disagree with the church's positions on various issues, including abortion and divorce. Not to mention the fact that Cuomo is not a priest. He doesn't have the power to join 2 people in holy matrimony. Billy Joel. I read the biography of Billy Joel that came out a couple of years ago. I don't like Billy Joel's music, but I mean, the guy has sold, what, 150 million records or whatever. And it was a very interesting book. And Billy Joel has been rubbish with women from the very beginning. It's just really kind of appalling how weak he is and how he was just been consistently taken to the cleaners by woman after woman after woman. So Andrew Cuomo, he's on the market apparently, and apparently he is just so hot. In Marie Claire, which I believe is a fashion magazine, girlfriend is America. What? Trapped in my apartment, nowhere to focus my hormones. Ugh, this is going to get ugly. The governor is the only man speaking directly to me for miles around. I was eating ice-cold Tostitos cheese with a spoon at my desk on a recent Monday morning, gearing up to wrangle my inbox and not open the shades for the 9th day of quarantine in a row, when my phone started buzzing. Check Facebook, check Twitter. Are you okay? It was an emergency. My boyfriend, New York Governor Andrew Cuomo, I learned, had a new girlfriend. America. LOLOL if you want. Everyone I know did. The old gag was that people voted for political candidates based on the question, who would you rather have a beer with? That line was used about George W. Bush, but he doesn't drink. I assume it was be men making that decision, and increasingly women seem to be making their decision on who to vote for based on who they would rather have sexual intercourse with. I would advise Andrew Cuomo to be very careful, to watch his back. This is from Vogue, which is allegedly also a fashion magazine. Dear Andrew Cuomo, I want to be your first lady, by Chelsea Handler. So one of America's most notorious skanks has set her cap at you, Andrew. Forewarned is forearmed. She writes, it's been almost a year since the Mueller report came out, and since Robert Mueller was a regular fixture in my life. As with any breakup, I have taken this time to lick my wounds, prepare myself to love again, and try to manage my expectations with any future lovers, precisely what gets me into trouble time and again. Bob Mueller filled the void of dignity and valor. Ugh, I don't know that I can. I don't know that I can go on. Governor Cuomo, do you know how dehydrated we've been? Do you know how thirsty we are to have a real leader, someone who can speak about policy, who can humanize statistics, who can string together a complex sentence that doesn't contain a single lie, or just string together a complex sentence armed with facts? You're giving us the courage to face our fears. What? Okay. Then she starts talking about some man masturbating into a plant. She's really a disgusting person, this Chelsea Handler. She's one of these people who's, oh yes, in 2010, it was confirmed that a leaked sex tape of Handler was being offered for sale. As news of it became public, Handler said on Chelsea lately that the tape was made as a joke more than 10 years earlier, adding, "I put it on an audition tape for a comedy club because I'm a comedian, and I've been showing it at birthday parties for fucking years." In a 2011 interview in the New York Times, Handler revealed that she had an abortion when she was 16, saying she had the procedure because that's what I should have done. Otherwise, I would now have a 20-year-old kid. Can you imagine having a 20-year-old kid? That's just like the worst thing imaginable. Anyway, those are things that people shouldn't be dishonest about. In a 2016 interview with Playboy, Handler revealed that she had a second abortion when she was 16, in addition to the one she talked about with the New York Times. Well, Governor Cuomo and Chelsea Handler do certainly share the same very strong views on abortion. So perhaps they are, and we know that Andrew Cuomo has a penchant for celebrities, so perhaps they are a better match than I asserted at the beginning. So let's talk about the view from the island here. 9,005 cases in Canada, 105 deaths. And Canada has a population of 38 million. 24 cases in my province of British Columbia. 24. And British Columbia has a population of 5.1 million people. Well, I do live on an island, and there are certain advantages to living on an island, and one of those advantages is isolation. People complain about the ferry system and, you know, the long ride to the ferry, and then the long wait in traffic, and then the very slow boat going to Tsawwassen, and then you have to, you know, drive out and get to downtown Vancouver. It's a long turnaround, but, you know, when a pandemic shows up, isolation is a good thing. So what's happening on Vancouver Island? Let me just check here. The number of cases on Vancouver Island is below 100. There's 72 cases. There's 72 cases on the whole island and not a single death. And the economy has been destroyed. The economy has been destroyed. Again, this matriarchal consensus and, you know, mimesis, well, everyone else is doing it. It would be grossly irresponsible not to. Yeah, perhaps we should have some very serious examination of potential consequences before you decide to destroy the economy, perhaps for years, perhaps forever, and also to literally end life as we have known it. Let's see. Canadian officials say isolation orders will be in place for a long time. I don't think Canada is going to survive this. I really don't. I had predicted that Canada was going to break up within a decade, but this could come very quickly now. Our Prime Minister, Princess Rockstar, says Canada hasn't seen this type of civic mobilization since the Second World War. Fun fact about Justin Trudeau's father, Pierre Trudeau, that Canada entered World War II one day after Britain did. That is to say, in September of 1939. And so there were Canadian troops on the streets of Montreal, where Pierre Trudeau grew up. And he would ride his motorcycle around in the streets of Montreal, wearing a German army helmet. And when he saw Canadian soldiers on the street, he would give them the Roman, the Nazi salute. What a charming fellow, huh? But let's talk about the Second World War. Let's see, 50, it ended 75 years ago, so there's a relative handful of people living in Canada who have any memories of the Second World War, let alone fought in it. But that was the last good war? And I suppose, yeah, just like the Second World War. Well, yeah, so that must mean that the government should be able to do whatever they want. How to shop for groceries in a pandemic. Is it really that more difficult? You've got to follow these lines now, and there's voices coming on the PA. It's like they live. We're all in this together. So the voices are actually saying, a really weird new normal. These are headlines from the CBC News site. Parents, students grapple with learning at home amid pandemic. Canadian suppliers won't have N95 masks ready for months, forcing government to look abroad. Wear masks if you want, but keep up the hand washing and physical distancing, say Tam and Hajdu. Hajdu is the Minister of Health. Dr. Theresa Tam, who is a native of Hong Kong, she's the one who said right at the beginning that this was all about racism and stigmatization. She is not keen on the use of masks. There was a story, at least earlier on this site, suggesting that young Canadians or younger Canadians were being particularly irresponsible, that they were not cowed by the new totalitarian regime, and apparently they're committing the sin, for sin is what it is, of actually leaving their homes and perhaps engaging in social activities, having some fun. Fun has been banned for the duration. From the National Post, best case scenario, COVID-19 measures expected to last at least until July, government document says. That's 3 months away. There's not going to be an economy left. There's not going to be an economy left if this goes on until July. So I thought that I would end the show with a brief discussion of my favorite royal, or quasi-royal, Meghan Mertz, who is the Duchess of Sussex. There's a story from the Daily Express in London. Meghan Mertz terrified as Duchess and Harry face financial nightmare over Brexit. Meghan and Prince Harry are running out of funding after repaying the costs for the multi-million-pound refurbishment of their Frogmore Cottage home, sparking concerns for the future of the Duchess of Sussex. And, in these days, we're especially worried about this worthless, grasping woman. Meghan and Prince Harry agreed to pay back the money spent for the refurbishment of Frogmore Cottage into the royal purse as part of their deal with the Queen. As part of their bid for independence from the royal family, the Duke and Duchess of Sussex say they want to become financially separate from the Queen and will be looking for new sources of income. Meghan last week was confirmed to have struck up a deal with Disney to narrate their latest documentary, Elephant. Yeah, I'm sure the box office is going to be boffo for that, seeing as all the theaters have been closed down. But the Duchess donated the money as the project was filmed before she and Harry announced their departure from the royal family. A royal insider claimed Meghan is terrified because of the financial pressure they are now under and suggested the Duchess has ordered Prince Harry to find a job. Meghan is terrified that her dreams of being a Hollywood queen will be destroyed by this financial nightmare, and she is insisting that Harry make a move and resolve the crisis. The insider, however, noted the lack of previous working experience could make the search for a new job difficult for the Duke of Sussex. The big problem is that Harry has no marketable skills, has never had a real job. He does not have a university degree, nor does he know a second language. He only has military training. Harry has given up on real life for his rebellious American wife, but his sacrifice is exploding in his face. Their marriage is tense. They could be at a breaking point. Well, it's long been my belief that Meghan Mertz had a plan. I mean, she's no spring chicken. She's, 3 years older than him? She's 38 years old. And so, she's got a limited amount of how would you say, top-class party time left. So I think that, and I believe this for some time, that she is going to divorce Harry. And I guess the hope is that she gets some sort of a courtesy title from the Queen as payment for going away, as future or as previous divorcees have. I suppose Harry could then slink back to Britain and attempt to worm his way back into the graces of his elder brother. I suspect that Britons would be willing to forgive him. As for Meghan, she could call herself the Duchess of Sussex, even if she wasn't, even if she didn't have the right to do so. I mean, what's the royal family going to do? Are they going to slap an injunction on her? She wants to go back to the entertainment industry, but more than that, she wants the big money, which becomes associated with being a big celebrity. Perhaps a reality show is in her future. Meghan and Archie. Yeah, they actually named their child Archie. Well, I say their child, but there seems to be considerable confusion about who this child is and who the actual parents of this child are. But let's see. Prince Harry has accrued experience in the charity sector through years of working with his brother, Prince William, with the Royal Foundation. He has also served for over 10 years in the British Army and took up active duty in Afghanistan before being called back to the UK after his location was disclosed to the public. The Duke and Duchess of Sussex agreed to give up any claim to funds through the royal purse, but an estimated 95% of the funds the couple has been using is believed to have come directly from the Prince of Wales's income generated through the Duchy of Cornwall. And Harry and Meghan have also signaled they are not ready to accept handouts in their new life after sharing details of their security arrangements. Golly, who could have thought that this would go all J.G. Ballard as it has? There's a perhaps fatal lack of discipline in the British royal family. This was not a suitable wife for Prince Harry, but just as Diana was not a suitable wife for Prince Charles. It takes a certain type of person to put up with the regime, which is part and parcel of being a working royal. And is anyone still talking about racism? I suppose, Meghan, she's in Los Angeles now, apparently. She's said goodbye to Canada. For several months, she was living a few miles up the road from where I live. Apparently, there were no thanks to Canada. No thanks for us paying for their protection bills. But this protection, do they need protection from what? I mean, have you ever heard of a celebrity fall so far, so fast? And it couldn't happen to a nicer couple, as they say. So I'm going to final look at the chat here. I think a lot of the overreaction. Okay, I already read that. Let's go to the latest here, very latest. Glib Medley says, when KMG shows over, next up on my feed is how to make rock candy DIY science experiment. Okay. Glib Medley, I would be quite happy to take Kevin through the process of playing clips. I talked about that a few weeks ago, and that was premature on my part. It may not be premature now, but I'm good on this show till the end of the week, and after that, I don't know. Again, I'll say that I had underestimated not the learning curve so much as the experience curve of having to carry a show single-handedly for 2 hours, 5 days a week. And I've gotten more used to it. I think I'm more facile at it. And so adding bells and whistles is conceivable now, when I don't think that it would have been a good idea to jump in the deep end with all of that at the beginning. Let's see. Veronica Meadows, Respecter, says closing the Canadian borders promptly in January and encouraging mask use would have been the most effective steps to slow the virus, but maintain more internal sanity. Well, yeah, we don't want to offend China and we don't want to be racist. Yes, guests, yes. A millennial female sidekick would double his audience. Is there anyone in mind? Our Finnish friend says she's going to divorce Harry. Well, there's still some money to take. I don't think there's going to be any money. I don't think she's going to get any money out of Harry. I think the lawyers took care of that. I think the best she can hope for is a courtesy, a title. And Lift One says Harry can find employment in a local haberdasher shop. Yes, it reminds me of that scene, one of the interviews at the end of Spinal Tap. Christopher Guest talking about chapeaux and the like. And on that thought, I am ending the show for Wednesday. Tomorrow is Theater Thursday, and we are going to talk about Cameron Crowe's 1992 romantic comedy Singles. Did a lot of good-looking women in that film, including Bridget Fonda, who is just, I don't know, maybe the most beautiful woman ever in the movies. I don't know, the idea that Bridget Fonda would have a hard time finding a man, it's rather difficult. It's rather difficult. But it is a most enjoyable movie. If one is allergic to romance, I suppose one wouldn't enjoy it very much. I'd like to thank everyone for watching, for tuning in. If you like the show or any part of it, I'd appreciate it if you'd click on the like button and subscribe to my YouTube channel. I will be back on the air tomorrow at 4 p.m. Pacific time, 7 p.m. Eastern. If you'd like to support the show, my PayPal address is kevin_grace@hotmail.com. Good night to all of you, and I hope that you find social companionship in these difficult times.